and we were out on the wide white moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead, not a sound, save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy silence of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand and his shadow at his feet. I followed, with my gun over my shoulder, as little inclined for conversation as himself. My thought was full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears. His eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day with surprise how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images and fragments of splendid reasoning in the very words in which he had uttered them. Musing thus over what I had heard, and striving to recall a lost link here and there, I strode on at the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Presently, at the end, as it seemed to me, for only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt and said, "Yon's your road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand, and you can't fail off the way." "This, then, is the old coach road?" "Aye, 'tis the old coach road." "And how far do I go before I reach the crossroads?" "9 upon 3 mile." I pulled out my purse, and he became more communicative. "The road's a fair road enough," said he, "for foot passengers, but 'twas over steep and narrow for northern traffic. You'll mind where the parapet's broken away, close again the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident." "What accident?" The night mail pinched right over into the valley below, a good 15 feet and more, just at the worst bit of road in the whole country." "Horrible! Were many lives lost?" "All. 4 were found dead, and 2 others died the next morning." "How long is it since this happened?" "Just 9 years." "Near the signpost, you say? I will bear it in mind. Good night." "Good night, sir, and thank ye." Jacob pocketed his half-crown, made a faint pretense of touching his hat, and trudged back the way he had come. I watched the light of his lantern until it quite disappeared, and then turned to pursue my way alone. This was no longer matter of the slightest difficulty, for, in spite of the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to! How silent and how solitary! A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me, and I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune, I cast up enormous sums in my head, and accumulated them at compound interest. I did my best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had just been listening to, and to some extent I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though, instead of traversing a quiet north country highway, I was scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. This last symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I chanced to look back on the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light like the gleam of an approaching lantern. I had first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel with the first, and approaching at the same rate of motion. I needed no second thought to show me that these must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle. though it seemed strange that any private vehicle should take a road professedly disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of the fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment, and I even fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage between them. It was coming up very fast and quite noiselessly, the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost, and could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time, for here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, one outside passenger, and 4 steaming greys, all wrapped in a soft haze of light through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up, the guards, muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters, and apparently sound asleep in the rumble, neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travelers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was perverted by a singular damp and disagreeable smell. I looked round at my fellow passengers. They were all 3 men and silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in a corner of the vehicle, as if absorbed in its own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. "The winter," I added, "seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. At any other time I should have felt and perhaps expressed some annoyance, but at the moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside of the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objections to opening a window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation, apparently, of years. My attention being thus drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly, and saw by the uncertain light of the outer lamps that it was in the last stage of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a condition of decay. The sashes splintered at a touch, the leather fittings were crusted over with mold and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp, and had evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been moulding away for years, to do another day or 2 of duty on the road. I turned to the 3rd passenger, who I had not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repairs?" He moved his head slowly and looked me in the face without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turn cold at heart even now as I recall it. His eyes glowed with a fury unnatural luster. His eyes were livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back as if in the agony of death, and showed the gleaming teeth beneath. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror, a dreadful horror, came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He, too, was looking at me, with the same startling pallor in his face and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own and saw— oh, heaven, how shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that none of them were living men like myself. A pale phosphorescent light, the light of petrification, played upon their awful faces, upon their hair, dank with dew of the grave, upon their clothes, earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy burst from my lips, and I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beheld in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud, the ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by when I awoke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued and give you in half a dozen words the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I had fallen over a precipice close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that had accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In this snowdrift I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds, who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull. The letters in my pocketbook showed my name and address. My wife was summoned to nurse me, and thanks to youth and fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before. I never told my wife of the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a mere dream born of the fever in my brain. We discussed the question over and over again, until we found that we could not discuss it with temper no longer, and we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago, I was the 4th passenger inside that phantom coach. The end. Hope you enjoyed some chills today, and hope to see you next week for a different type of story. Bye for now.